بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ننتقل الآن إلى الموضوع الأخير عندنا في هذه المراجعة. Now we will talk about adding multiple vector components to calculate the resultant vector. الآن resultant vector R has two components اللي هما R sub x and R sub y. To find both components, the following formulas are used. To find Rx, we just add the x components of all of the vectors that make the resultant vector R. And in the case of Ry, we add the x or the y components of all of the vectors that make the vector R. The magnitude of vector R then is calculated using the Pythagorean theorem اللي هو R is equal to the square root of Rx squared plus Ry squared. Now, in this illustration, we will understand the main concept of the previous slide. Here we have three different vectors اللي هما U, V and W. Now we can draw vector R which is basically the resultant of the three vectors. And how can we find vector R? Either by using the head-to-tail method or by finding the x component of all of the three vectors and the y components of the three vectors. Then by adding the x component of the three vectors and the y components of the three vectors, we get Rx and Ry. This table basically will give us the steps to find the resultant vector of multiple vectors. أولاً, we identify the vector components. Then we use the trigonometry to find the x and y components of the vectors. We remember that the x component of any vector, let's assume that we have vector A, then the x component of vector A is equal to A cosine theta, which is basically the horizontal component that lies on the x-axis. On the other hand, the y component of vector A is equal to A sine theta. And this component will lie on the y-axis, the whole vertical component. Then we can also draw the components, but we also can get rid of this step because in most of the cases we don't need to draw the components. And then we go to part 2. After resolving all vectors, now we find the sum for all of the x components and the y components. Why? Because the sum of all horizontal components will give us the x component of the resultant vector R. And the summation of all vertical components will give us the y component of vector R. Then we calculate the magnitude of the resultant vector R by using the Pythagorean theorem, where R is equal to the square root of Rx squared plus Ry squared. And finally, we determine the direction of the resultant vector R by using the tangent function. And we remember that to find theta, it's equal to tan inverse always the y component divided by the x component. مين عندي the y component in this case? It's R sub y. So Ry divided by Rx, which is the x component. والملاحظة المهمة جدا احنا طبعا ذكرناها مسبقا بأنه the angle used to find the components of vectors must always be measured from the positive x-axis. ناخذ مع بعض مثال الأول حتى نفهم كيف نوجد the resultant vector of multiple vectors. In this question we have two different vectors اللي هما A and B. A has a magnitude of 10 Newton and makes an angle of 30 degrees with the positive x-axis. While vector B makes an angle of 60 degrees with the negative x-axis and it has a magnitude of 13 Newton. So first of all, we start by finding the x component of vectors A and B. Let's start with AX. AX is equal to A cosine theta, which is equal to 10 multiplied by cosine. الآن الزاوية مرسومة عندنا من positive x-axis, so we take it as is. Then we get AX equals 8.66 Newton. Now we go to BX. BX is equal to B cosine theta, which is equivalent to 13 multiplied by. الآن we can't take 60 as is. ليش؟ لأنه هاي الزاوية مرسومة عندنا من negative x-axis. What do? We have to draw the angle from this point counterclockwise to this point. طيب هاي الآن هي عبارة عن الزاوية المستخدمة. راح تكون عبارة عن شو؟ عبارة عن 180 minus 60. كم تعطينا هذا الجواب؟ طبعا بيطلع لنا الجواب 120. That's why here we substitute 120 degrees. Once we do that, we get the value of negative 6.5 newtons. And then we find the y component of vector A by multiplying 10 by sine 30. and نتذكر دائما بأنه ال y component باخذ الساين وال x component باخذ ال x أو الكوساين عفوا. فبيطلع عند الجواب 5 نيوتن. Then we go to the y component of vector b, which is basically b multiplied by sine theta. The magnitude of b is 13 as drawn in the image. And the angle again we take it 120 degrees instead of 60. بيطلع عند الجواب 11.26 newtons. Then we find r sub x, which is ax plus bx. That is equal to 8.66 plus negative 6.5, which is 2.16 newtons. And then we find ry, which is ay plus by. That's equal to 5 plus 11.26, and the answer is 16.26 newtons. Now we have r sub x, r sub y. We can find the magnitude of vector r, which is the resultant of the two vectors a and b. And in this case, r is equal to the square root of rx squared plus ry squared. And that is equal to 16.4 newtons. And finally, the direction of the resultant vector r can be used by using the tangent function, where theta is equal to tan inverse of ry divided by rx. يطلع عند الجواب 82.4 degrees. ننتقل الآن إلى السؤال اللي بعده. بيحكي لنا في هذا السؤال again find the resultant force using the graph. احنا بنتخيل الآن إنه في عندنا 3 different forces. في عندنا A equals 15 نيوتن, B equals 7 نيوتن, and C now we have 3 vectors instead of 2. So C is equal to 10 newtons. الآن A lies on the x-axis, B lies on the y-axis, and C makes an angle of 25 degree counterclockwise from the negative x-axis. نتذكر بأنه هاي الزاوية ما بنقدر ناخذها كما هي, لازم نحسب الزاوية from the positive x-axis. So we go there, and to find this angle in the red color, it's equal to what? It's equal to 25 plus 90 plus 90 اللي هو 180, which is basically 205 degrees. So let's start by finding the x component of all of the vectors. نكتب الآن ax is equal to. الآن بنلاحظ بأنه since A lies on the x-axis, فبالتالي the x component of A will be the number as is اللي هو 15. لكن ال y component راح يكون 0. راح نشوف كمان شوي. طب شو بالنسبة للB؟ بما أنه B يقع بشكل كامل على ال y, فبالتالي it does not have any x component. مقدارها كم؟ 0. إذن when the vector lies on the x-axis, that means it has a magnitude of, أو عفوا ال x component will be the value itself, لكن ال y component راح يكون 0. والعكس صحيح. طيب ننتقل الآن إلى اللي هو x component of vector C. We say that C sub x is equal to C cosine the angle. Again, we found the angle to be 205. By substituting 10 times cosine 205, we get negative 9 newtons. And then we go to the y components of the 3 vectors. Say that ay, and in this case, since A lies on the x-axis, that means the y component is equal to 0. So we say ay is equal to 0 newton directly. There is no need to solve. Then we go to by, which is equal to the value itself, which is 7 newton because it lies on the y-axis. And finally, we go to c sub y, which is c sine theta. We multiply 10, the magnitude of c, by sine 205 again, and the answer is negative 4.23 newtons. Then we find the magnitude of the resultant vector r by summing ax and bx and cx, which is equal to 15 plus 0 plus negative 9, and the answer is 6 newtons. And now we find r sub y, which is equal to ry plus by plus cy, and that is equal to 0 plus 7 plus اللي هو negative 4.23. بيطلع عند الجواب 2.77 نيوتن. الآن we have found rx, ry. Let's find the magnitude of vector r. The magnitude of vector r is equal to the square root of rx squared plus ry squared, and that is equal to 6 squared plus 2.77 squared, which gives us 6.6 newtons. And finally, to find the direction of the resultant vector r, we have to find the angle. دائما الدايركشن يعبر عنه بزاوية. So theta is equal to tan inverse of ry divided by rx. بيطلع عن الجواب 24.8 degrees. طبعا احنا لاحظنا بأنه ال X وال Y components في كلا السؤالين كانوا قيم موجبة، فبالتالي لما نحسب الزاوية ما في داعي للتصحيح. ليش؟ لأنه ال RX وال RY both are positive, meaning that R lies in the first quadrant. The resultant vector lies in the first quadrant. فبالتالي the direction that we calculate using the calculator will be correct without any need for any type of correction. ننتقل الآن إلى السؤال الأخير. في هذا السؤال we have again three vectors. We have vector A, B and C. Vector A has a magnitude of 15 newtons and it makes an angle of 45 degrees from the negative x-axis in the counterclockwise direction. And vector B has a magnitude of 7 newton and it makes an angle of 45 degrees clockwise direction from the negative x-axis. And finally, vector C makes an angle of 15 degrees from the negative y direction in the counterclockwise direction, and the magnitude of C is 4 newtons. أولا, we start by finding theta A, theta B and theta C. بالنسبة ل theta A we go from this point to this point. طبعا كم مقدار هاي الزاوية؟ راح تكون عبارة عن 180 plus 45. طيب, what about B? For B we go from this point counterclockwise to that point. كم راح تكون هاي القيمة؟ هي عبارة عن ممكن نحكيها يعني 180 ناقص 45 أو 90 plus 45 بيطلع عندي 135 for both cases. And finally, to find theta for C, we go from the positive x-axis counterclockwise till we reach this point. كم راح تكون هاي؟ عبارة عن 90 plus 90 plus 90 plus the angle here which is 15. نبدأ الآن بحساب ال X component للفيكتور A, B و C. We say that AX is equal to A cosine theta. And again, we say that the theta here is from this point to this point, which is 90 plus 90 plus 45, and that gives us 225. And the answer here is negative 10.6. Then we go to BX. Again, for BX, we go from this point counterclockwise to this point. What is the angle here? Which is 180 minus 45. And that is equal to 135. And the answer is negative 4.95. Then we go to CX, which is C cosine theta. The magnitude of C is 4. And the angle here is, again, from this point, counterclockwise till we reach the vector, which is basically 90 plus 90 plus 90 plus 15. And the answer is 285. Once we multiply 4 times cosine 285, we get 104 newtons. And then in the same fashion, we find AY, BY, CY. We find AY to be negative 10.6, BY to be 4.95 newtons, and CY to be negative 3.86 newtons. Once we find the X and Y components of all vectors, then we can find the X and Y components of the resultant vector. نحكي بأنه ال RX is equal to AX plus BX plus CX. بيطلع عندي الجواب negative 14.51 newtons. And RY is equal to AY plus BY plus CY. بيطلع عندي الجواب negative 9.51 newton. بنلاحظ بأنه ال X وال Y components of the resultant vectors or the resultant vector عفوا both are negative. فبالتالي we expect that this vector R lies in the third quadrant because the X and Y components of vector R are both negative. فبالتالي let's start by finding the magnitude of vector R using Pythagorean theorem. بيطلع عندي الجواب 17.35 newtons. And finally, we find the direction of vector R which lies in the third quadrant. طلع لنا الآن theta is equal to tan inverse ry over rx. لا ننسى إنه بنعوض الساين، لازم نكتب negative 9.51 على negative 14.51. الآن الجواب اللي بيطلع معنا اللي هو 33.24 في الكالكوليتر، لكن here we have to do a correction because it lies in the third quadrant by adding 180 degrees to the answer we get in the calculator. بيطلع عند الجواب 213.24 degrees. هيك احنا بنكون خلصنا هذا السؤال بشكل كامل. طبعا from the answer we can tell that vector R has a magnitude of 17.35 newtons and it lies in the third quadrant. طيب كيف أنا ممكن أرسم هذا الريزلتنت فيكتور مع الدايركشن؟ الآن فعليا إحنا كأن استبدلنا جميع القوى الموجودة عندنا في الرسم اللي على اليسار بقوة وحيدة موجودة عندنا في الرسم لليمين، فبالتالي this resultant vector R is equivalent to A مع ال B مع ال C. And as you can see, the direction of the vector R we have found to be 213.24 degrees and the magnitude of this vector is 17.35 نيوتن. يعني هاي الايكوفالنت هاي ال R أو resultant vector R is equivalent to all of these forces acting on an object. يعني لو فرضا وضعنا object عند الأوريجن في الصورة الأولى وطبقنا عليه القوة A و B و C بالاتجاهات المذكورة، راح الجسم يتحرك في هذا الاتجاه بسبب قوة مقدارها 17.35 نيوتن. هيك احنا بنكون خلصنا هذا السؤال بشكل كامل.